Hi, I'm Lenina Rassool, your host for Mental Health Matters on Cape Town TV, where every week I sit down with a mental health professional to discuss all things mental health and more. And today we are going to be speaking about trauma. Now, trauma has become quite a buzzword of late, but even though it's been used very widely and frequently, we don't know very much about how it really affects us. There have been a few books that have been written speaking directly about how trauma affects the brain, the body, and our abilities to cope once we've been through a traumatic situation. After the break, we are sitting down with a trauma professional to discuss all things trauma, what it is, how it affects us, what we can do to help us cope with traumatic situations. But before that, we are going to have a look at a short video around trauma to help us contextualize the conversation. Let's have a look.
Hey, welcome back. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and today we are speaking about trauma. We're looking at what is trauma, how does trauma affect our brains and our behavior, and just having a generalized conversation around this. And joining me back in studio is Yasmin Gabie.
Thanks, Lenina.
I'm so glad to have you back, Yasmin. And so we are speaking about trauma, and you know, one of the things I said earlier is that trauma is so, is so popular now. We're seeing lots of memes on it and so across social media. People are talking about it, people are acknowledging it, and that is good. But I think there isn't a basic understanding of what exactly constitutes trauma. And so I think what I wanted us to start with is what is trauma? And then also, is it only just big things like car accidents or divorce, or, you know, there is some narrative about little traumas as well. Is that valid?
I think in a very basic way, what trauma is, it's a big event in your body that you can't emotionally cope with at that point. So when it's too big, you need a level of support. So when you are little, you tend to look up at somebody to pick you up or to sort of contain the trauma. But when you're older, that lies on you. And what does that look like? That is just an unrested nervous system freaking out and finding a way to bring it down and calm yourself down. So that in its basic term, that is what trauma is. And when you ask the question of, is everybody traumatized? I would say we are in South Africa. As South Africans, every single person living in South Africa will have some level of trauma. That's not in your homeland. It's just because we're living in that level of anxiety. You know, when you step into the home, we have to be so vigilant to our safety, to our care, to how we're going to get to work, can we afford it, can we get there, is it safe? So all of those little dynamics puts us in a, I like this word, discombobulated.
Okay.
It's a nice word, discombobulated. It puts us in a discombobulated state, which just shows, and by the time you get 9 o'clock to work, you're already discombobulated. So it doesn't take much then for somebody to touch you, to look at you, to create that, for a reaction to happen. So yes, trauma is in its very minute form in that, let me take that back. Trauma is active. How you respond to it is, unfortunately, you look to the media, you look to things to say, I'm being too dramatic. There's nothing bad has really happened to me, so I shouldn't be acting like that. But that's not true. You have to take the event that's too big for your body. It's intimate to you. It's your intimate event that has happened that you can't cope with. And that's traumatic. It's as simple and as basic as that. And you asked about big traumas and little traumas. So there's a big T, which is acute trauma, which is the death, which is loss, which is cancer, divorce, moving. You know, moving is a big deal. Having children under the age of 5. I'm trying to list all the things I can recollect at this point. But those are big traumas, right? And then you get your little T's, the little things that impact your body each day. I mean, each day you come, perhaps you meet the same colleague with the same negative feedback each day, and that impacts you. Or you get up and you're a teenager and there's consistent fighting in the home. Or you go to school and you meet your passive-aggressive teacher, which you can't really speak up to because when you speak, you're belligerent and disrespectful. but the teacher can be passive aggressive. That's traumatic. So you would take it on a little scale, as in little people, as in 4-year-olds, 2-year-olds. Just picture the world right now. They've been put into kindergarten at a very young age because we live in South Africa where there's a dual need for parents, both partners to work, leaving the latchkey kid, which means a child is put into the safety of somebody else. And think about that for a minute. So all those things, so yes, trauma is, and I'm a trauma specialist, so of course people go, of course you're going to call out trauma wherever you see it, right? But I think it's, for me, I'd like just to shine the light on it to go, yes, you're not okay. You know, and no, you're not okay. You know, you can be okay, you have resilience, but first have a look at the obstacles before you have to have a look at it before you can clear it. So you have to acknowledge that you're in it before you can do something about it. If you are going with, I'm fine, I'm good, and there's no awareness about it, what are you doing? Just creating more chaos with yourself. And imagine that pebble in the world. You are the little pebble. You start entering the world, and just picture that ripple.
Yeah.
So,
I want to come to something you said, and it's really, I think, to discombobulated, because I wrote it down here. You mentioned sort of the nervous system being dysregulated. And so, you know, some of the narrative is coming out, and, you know, one of the books is The Body Keeps the Score, where he's talking about, often we think about mental health as being in the mind. Like, I whenever we think about physical brain, we're thinking like in the mind, these things are happening, and some way, shape, or form we're supposed to handle it. But what was interesting about The Body Keeps the Score and about this book was it gave us a physical manifestation of how trauma affects us. So trauma can affect the body. And I wanted to ask about that. The nervous system is a physical process, and some of the ways that it manifests physically. Some of the things I was thinking about was PTSD, for instance. Panic attacks, which is a very physical thing, in shortness of breath. So how does trauma affect the body?
So before it was regarded that trauma was a mind thing, because there was no way to gauge how would you, because you thought it, right? It was all thoughts, a rumination, that you get stuck in that, and depressed wasn't actually a physical thing. You can't wake up, and there was no acknowledgement given to depression, because like the I'm thinking of the, anyways, I've lost it. It's the working ethic. So as long as you're working, you're okay. The moment you are resting, something is not okay. So you're working to that sort of ethic. So now we've all sort of encumbered or encompassed in that ethic, that work ethic. So when you stop working, there's a sense of shame and guilt associated with that, especially in South Africa, right? Where things are needing to find employment, needing to find yourself, you're needing to all that. But coming back to the idea of how it manifests in the body, now we know with fMRI scans that trauma, once it lights up an area of your brain that's linked to a specific part of your body, there's nothing you will experience that is not felt in the body. Think any thought, you will feel it somewhere inside your body. You don't need an fMRI scan, you just feel. And the idea is, and when you do sit with that feelings, the feelings can be so deep that it's too much for you to deal with at that minute. And that's where the shutdown happens. And when you shut it down, your body goes into what we call a hijacking of the nervous system. It goes into automatic survival mode. So your body is so intelligent enough to know that at this point, too much is happening for you. It goes into survival, it shuts itself down. So when you are overloaded with work, and you see that pile of books and you still need that deadline, and you feel you can't get to it, chastisement happens, right? Because the failure, the procrastination, the worthlessness, the character assassination happens. But if you would take that out of the equation and just go, I'm completely overwhelmed right now, my body's gone into survival mode, I'm being hijacked by the shutdown, because it's actually telling me to shut down and go take rest. If you are able to take that rest, if you're able to acknowledge it, when you take that papers on, it's taken from much more of a stronger stance, because now you know what's going on. But when you come from a shameful stance, it's almost impossible to take on that burden of the work, because you have now character assassinated you. And what happens when you character assassinate? You go back into your child, You go back into a diminished state. You go back into a timeline where that something or someone had shamed you in that way. And then you can't be the adult in that minute. You are the child in that minute. And then what do? You look for support. You look at what does a child need? A child needs support, a child needs guidance, a child needs structure. But when you're an adult going to your child, what happens there is that everything seems overwhelming. Everything seems debilitating. Everything is against you in that minute because you are your only resource in that space. And that is where the trauma is. When only you, throughout your life, you've been the only one doing everything. You're the only one that you've been your only resource from such a little age till now. And you don't know that help can be found because you can't trust. Because everywhere the lines have been drawn when you were little, that all you had to do was look inside your own self. You had to internalize your resources. And so that is where we find majority of people right now, is that there's a whole, I won't say planet, I'll go to South Africa, right? Where we are all these children that have raised ourselves, that are walking around now in jobs, in every sphere, that are highly traumatized because we are the unmothered and unfathered children. Not because we didn't have parents, because we didn't have the type of parents that could provide that type of resource to bring down the nervous system, to contain it, to be able to say, you are okay. And this is not to judge our parents. They had no resources. So this is not a judgment on our caregivers. This is the time to have compassion for them, to go, imagine we still have resources. We click on YouTube, we've got all these channels, there's so much information out there. Our parents had no resources. Our caregivers had nothing. They just had to rely on their disrupted nervous system. So we were brought up by children, right? If you think about it.
And so also there was no narrative around sort of emotions back then. There was no, and a lot of that is evidenced by, seen and not heard. Children weren't allowed to speak about emotions, but also from what you are saying, parents didn't also know how to speak about emotions. They didn't know that there was something deeper sort of happening. It seems to be there was just an element of control. Control yourselves, don't feel your feelings, we should barely cry. Right?
And also what we forget is that, or we don't know, that at that generation, adults saw to themselves. Nobody saw to the children. So if anything was happening, nobody ever looked to the child to think that there was a level of disruption happening there. The child wasn't even considered. It is only now in this generation, in 2022, where the child is considered, where the research is actually looking at how soon the impact of the trauma happens. I mean, it's gone now in utero, right? That's how much the research has gone to. Whereas before we would have taken as the 7-year-old child. And then Piaget, okay, there's so many philosophers.
Plus 1,000
so we
days
can
and
really
all of those
dive
things.
into whenever. But the recognition of when trauma, there was no awareness around that children could be impacted. And the carry and the pattern and the generational trauma.
Yes.
So that's the compassion we have for our parents and that generation, to go, you were actually clueless. We have compassion for you, but however, we are still the result of that type of parenting. And here we are, and it's our responsibility now to take this and go, okay, how can we stop the pattern here? How can we be the warriors? And I tell you, working with emotional well-being is a warrior energy. You need to be really strong, you need to stand up, you need to fight this. It is not something you can just take and go one day. It's taking full-on action to recognize. And I will say, if you are questioning, are you traumatized? Yes, you are traumatized. Figure out where and how and get support.
So let's talk about that. One of the things also that comes up all the time, I mean, it's a big hashtag, trigger. Right. We see this thing of being triggered all over, all the time in South Africa, race, we see it sort of in the gender space also. But trigger essentially is, and from some of the reading that I've done, is a reaction to trauma. There's a trauma, there's something that triggers you, obviously. There's a pain point that gets hit that relates to some experience you had. And how I want to bring it into this conversation and the way that I've sort of been thinking about it is, sometimes when we speak about something triggering us, it means something's coming up in the body. Somebody says something, you're talking about, you feel like everyone's against you, but specific situations will bring up certain feelings of overwhelm, even if on the surface things seem very calm. I wanted to ask about when we are starting to acknowledge trauma, when we are trying to figure out where does my trauma lie? There's big trauma we can acknowledge. Yes, I have trauma. Certain things make me feel overwhelmed, but also can we be traumatized by things that we're not even intellectually aware of? Is the starting point realizing what kind of things give me discomfort, make me feel overwhelmed? And when you talk about in utero, it's so interesting because I sometimes wonder, shouting really gets me into some sort of survival mode and it can be anybody shouting. It doesn't even necessarily need to be someone shouting at me, but shouting in a tension-filled thing sort of sends me wanting to climb under a bed or under a table. I don't know how or where this originated so deeply that it affects me so deeply, but it's sort of something like that.
And let's unpack the triggers, right? Trigger, again in its basic form, is a need that hasn't been met, right? So you're at 4 years old, you hear somebody shouting, you need to have that contained because something is not feeling safe. A caregiver comes and says, no, that's okay. It's just a loud noise, or that person is angry because they stumped their toe, and then you go, it's not about me, and the trauma dissipates, or the trigger dissipates. But when that shouting happens, and there's no one to come and contain it, you carry that, right? So you carry that little event that's big. It's big in your body. It's not big to the world, but keep within your own intimate self, right? That happens. Now you go out to school, somebody else shouts. That memory plus that memory, it starts compounding. And so here you go through the world with no containing that. And what happens? What happens to that interest building on that compounding of that emotion? So you never need to know your story. You don't actually need to know at 5 years old, this is what happened. You just need to know that it's not. What I try and tell my clients is that the story is only important to make you understand that it happened when you were little. Nothing new is happening to today. So if you're angry at your boss today and you reactive to that emotion, your boss didn't create that. That happened when you were already 5 years old. And there's the link to that. That's the only time you need to go back in your past to figure out where it began, so to understand how it's manifesting in your current life. That is the only time we need to go back in these 3 books. So story is important, but the idea of where the trigger starts from is to know that all your triggers have begun in your BC life, before BT life, before trauma, right? So when we decide, or when we unpack what a trigger is, so now when you go out in the world and you are triggered by somebody shouting, you can now look and go, that is not you making me feel like that. I already feel like that within my body. You are just pressing the button, or you're just activating that which is already within me. And that is the call to healing. That is the awareness that comes to go, you are not the one doing that to me. I have this within me, and I need to find a way of settling this down. So you take the responsibility of the healing and you don't push it onto anyone else. And that is the beginning. If you can start just walking that slow walk to taking responsibility for, I am feeling like this, not because I'm being shouted at or somebody is, and let's put abuse in a different category here, right?
Yeah.
We were not going to go with the abuse here. We're just talking about emotional triggers in anxiety, right? So when something is happening to you, like your colleague has given you, or the 2 people are whispering and they're laughing, and that's at you. Nobody can make you feel discombobulated. You already feel like that. They are just the reminders that that is what you have inside of you.
Or almost feeling hyper-focused, that convinced that they are laughing at you, and it
And
might
then-
not even
And
be,
exactly,
you
right?
know, it's just 2
So,
people
because
talking.
that is what we call the projection. You project that disruption onto somebody else because it's safer to make you are the cause of what I'm doing. But when you start taking accountability and go, oh, I've always felt like this. This is something that creates disruption within me. then the healing can begin. The healing can only begin once you take accountability that this is me creating this is me sitting with this, and nobody out there can make me do this. Then I say the healing begins.
And sort of taking some ownership over your nervous system and understanding that this is my specific responses to specific sort of events that happen.
And looking at yourself like an algorithm, right? Like, here's an algorithm. This is what that A impacts me in this way.
Yeah.
And B impacts me in that way. Like, I can handle this. And, you know, before we get to trauma, before we even get to figuring out what makes us so disrupted, we actually have to figure out what makes us feel good in our body. That is a very, you know, we're always going to trauma and we're always fixing and fixing.
We're always looking at sort of the negative
But
side of it, but we're not
actually
balancing
makes
that
you
out.
feel good inside this vessel?
No, exactly. You know, and I wanted to say earlier, I think when you were answering the first question, that when you were saying we feel everything in the body, it's like love. Also, when they talk about having butterflies, that butterflies is an actual physical feeling, just from a positive sense. We are going to come back to that because we need to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and we are speaking about trauma, and we are in studio with Yasmin Gabie, who is a therapist that specializes in trauma. And Yasmin, before the break, we were talking about triggers, right? And we're talking about how these triggers affect our nervous system and how sort of the trauma that we have is often manifested in very physical ways, and the ways to start thinking about what our triggers are is thinking about how our body feels when we are triggered. And one of the things you said, I think, as we were finishing, was that, you know, we think about what feels bad in the body, but it's also important to think about what feels good in the body. And in fact, that's a starting point. And I think the good, we said offline in the break, is something that we really think about. I also want to ask, you know, in that way, when we think about the triggers and the trauma coming from things that happened to us, ways that it was things that weren't contained, events that possibly weren't contained, there's a book by Dr. Bruce Perry, and it was co-authored by Oprah. And I just like the concept in terms of the title of the book. The title of the book is What Happened to You? What was interesting for me is because the reason the title is that is because every time we have an adverse reaction, we think, what is wrong with me? What is wrong with that person? What is wrong with you? You know, someone else is having an adverse reaction to something we said. Someone else is triggered by something we said. We're like, what's wrong with that person? And I just want to come into like that these triggers are also a result of the things that happened to us, of the traumas that happened to us. And that's sort of what you were trying to get into, right?
Yeah, like the point of life is that something did happen.
Yeah.
Something happened. And because there's no evidence of it, you look up at the world and you look to show people something happened. But there's how do you, who's the witness to that? And then you carry that trauma within you by yourself, and it becomes lonely, it becomes, and what is depression? Depression is the grief of being so lonely. And often we look at loneliness and we look at and it's sort of manifests in, when we're older, we look for partners, we look for children, we look for connection. But the point of depression starts not at that point. It starts when you were little, when there was no witness to what happened to you. And that loneliness of that experience manifests in a big way when you're older, because your little body can't cope, it packs it away, it puts it somewhere safe until you're ready to deal with it. And when you're older, loneliness comes as this big monster that needs to be filled, this void that needs to be filled. And how do we fill it? We fill it with food, sex, drugs, exercise, Instagram, social media, Netflix, overworking. Anything that is taking you from stillness is a form of filling the void. Because if you are still, the void comes in. And the void is there as not a monster. Now there's enough memes to go around to show how ugly the monster looks, but if you actually look at it and you befriend it, it becomes a little person, it becomes you. The void is you. It is when you experience the biggest feelings of your life There was no witness to it, and you had to carry it by yourself. How lonely is that? And now when you are this age, when you're an adult, when you need to be adulting, here comes the void. It is so overwhelming that you need that. What happens? The panic hits, the anxiety goes, the depression hits. You can't cope because it is so disruptive. But the call to healing is there. When that happens, there is help. There are things that all you need to do is understand it. When you understand it, everything gets put into place. When you understand that an event happened was too big for the little you, but you are now strong enough to take it, then healing becomes, and it becomes, healing is not fun when you are, the before picture, before you ask for help, it is not fun. But when you ask for help, it becomes such a exciting journey. It becomes such a magical way because you start to get to know yourself. And the aha moments, like, oh, I didn't know.
Yeah.
That is so beautiful. When the shifts happen and you go, oh, I actually don't feel like that anymore.
Yes.
It is magical and it's wonderful.
You know, my favorite aha moment is, I have to say, every time, the more I learn, the more I speak to people, it's like, oh, and it's coming back to that, oh, there's nothing wrong with me, or I'm not wrong, oh, I understand this process, my nervous system is doing this. But for me, it's often very interesting about how, and maybe this relates to, as you were saying, the way we were raised, not speaking about emotions, being shamed for showing emotion, is a level of, because I feel these things that people are trying to suppress, because I'm crying when I'm not supposed to cry, I'm different to everybody else and I am alone. I do want to jump into also, because you're speaking about sort of the loneliness of the experience and so forth. Coming back to the way we were raised or the way we've dealt with traumatic events, often we've just had to get over it. I know for me, for a very, very long time, I was very fascinated by, and I had no language for what do you do with the trauma. So you just have to sort of shove it down or put it behind you or move on because the world doesn't stop turning. Whatever's happened, gosh, let's say traumatic divorce, you still need to go, find a place, go to work, provide, put food on the table every night. And the only way to really stay sort of functional to a degree is to like, okay, this thing happened, and then move, right? You move. It's unresolved. Something needs to happen. One of the terms that have come up in previous conversations or stuff I've read is release. Trauma can be released. When I heard that, I remember I was astounded. I had an aha moment. I had never heard that before. So can we talk about a trauma has happened? The general idea or what we've been told throughout our whole lives is like, okay, fine, even if we acknowledge it, this bad thing happened, but now we need to move on because the world is still going on. That trauma has not been dealt with. What should actually happen?
And I liked when you said that unresolved. I think that's it's such a beautiful word if you think about it. Your childhood is unresolved, and your responsibility is to resolve it. If you think about it in just unpacking that, is that something happened. If you can be your witness to your story, who is the witness to your story? There's only one witness that saw everything, that experienced everything, that was there the entire time, that knew what actually happened. Who is that witness?
Can I add something though? So often the events don't happen in isolation. Sometimes it does, we know, with single witness traumas. But also that the way you witness the trauma can be different to the way, let's say, your brother witnessed the trauma, right? So even though there were other people there, it doesn't mean that you'll naturally be affirmed.
And we're not talking even to the eyewitness. We're talking to the experience of the trauma.
Yes.
How you experienced it. Because each person will experience exactly the same thing, but will take on a completely different angle to it because their nervous system at that point is calibrated very differently to yours. So the way you take it on as opposed to your brother or your parents or whoever was in that. So we're not looking to the eyewitness of it. We're looking to how you've experienced yourself in that moment when you went through that. And who was the only one that could know, who knows the truth, is only you. Only you know. You are the only one that was awoke to that moment. And what you've done to yourself is discounted. No, it didn't happen like that. It shouldn't, I should have done this, I could have done that, I could have, and you discount that. But the higher knowing, the higher self, your higher intuition knows that you were the witness. And if you are able to come to that awareness to go, I was there, it was as bad as I'm feeling it. That in itself, I would say is very deep work. It's very, very deep work. The acknowledgement of it is quite deep and intensive. But the rewards are, it's as if, like something gets released, it's as if the shadow that you've been sitting with just gets, it evaporates for you. So coming back to the resolving of it, if you can understand that your responsibility is not anyone else out there, it is just you. Your purpose is to resolve your trauma. What is your trauma? Your trauma is a discombobulated nervous system. How do I regulate that? And if you just walk with that, you will find that as you heal, you will start feeling whole. And when you feel whole, people are attracted to that because they want to know, they want to have what you have. What did you have this morning, your Kellogg's?
I'm interested in what you in how you're weaving together sort of the idea of the concept of witnessing and the concept of release. And I want to give an example that I've used before. Yasmin, you're a board member at Lifeline, you know, and when you were on the last time, we were talking about Lifeline, and Lifeline offers 4 free sessions of counseling. Many years ago, I went on my first foray into counseling, and I went to go and see a counselor at Lifeline. And I remember I didn't know what's supposed to happen in counseling. So I had sort of prepared my life CV to rattle off because I thought you're supposed to go there and talk about the things in your life. And I had this initial experience. I'm telling the story about my life. You know, my parents got divorced, and I lost touch with my dad, and I'm just rattling it off very fast. But the counselor stops me, and the counselor says, I just want to, and the thing is, when I lost touch with my dad, we lost touch with each other, my way to contain that or deal with that or whatever, you know, I remember it was very painful, but I remember nobody was really talking about it, and my thought process as a teenager was, well, if you don't need me, then I don't need you. Finish, never thought about it again, never needed it, I was fine, I finished school, I did all the things I was supposed to do. But this counselor stops me and she says, you know, I know we can't go back and change anything, but what your dad did was not okay. And I burst into tears, sobbing. I'm laughing also because I'm saying, I dealt with this. This was not the thing that I thought I was going to burst into tears about at therapy. This was not the issue that brought me into therapy. And I said to her, I remember, I don't understand what's happening here. And so that was really interesting. That was like, here's this thing that I didn't even intellectually think was bothering me, but clearly it sat there, clearly it needed some release, and I did feel better afterwards. You know, it didn't change the physical situation. I didn't automatically become best friends with my dad or reach out or have heart-to-hearts and whatever, but you were able to bring in and see something within yourself. Yeah.
And the being witnessed and almost permission to feel like, you know, you've been carrying this for so many years, and somebody's saying, like, hand it over, that's not okay for you to carry that for so long. And you go like,
and the acknowledgement,
you know, like
it.
the shake and the go like, oh, somebody's going to take it from me. That level of, it is so beautiful and so poignant, I think, that moment where you realize that that's an aha moment when you broke, because you've been carrying it for so long. Finally, somebody took it. And, you know, tears are such a release, because, you know, we call it a purge when you release something of a big nature. It's a purge. And look how beautiful our tears are set. It has salt in it. And if you think of the ocean, you think of cleansing, you think of you know, salt. It cleans out the negative energy. The ocean, it takes out the negativity. Your body creates salt. Tears, water and tears when it's time to purge. How beautiful is that? We are so afraid of crying. But if you think of the beauty of the waterfall that cascades out of your body in time to release, it is actually such a a magical moment. And if we could look at it in magic and go, this is a magical moment, and not be afraid of it, the shifts happen.
So someone said to me once, and I absolutely loved it. They said, you know, crying is a bodily response the same way as laughter. Uncontrollable laughter. You hear something funny, you can't stop yourself. You feel some pain, you can't stop yourself. And we should shift towards crying being as acceptable as laughing is.
But it's not bad, right? So what I do with some of my clients is we do the laughing, because laughing and the belly ache comes from the same area. So when you laugh and you laugh and you laugh, it suddenly cracks open, and then boom, the crying just naturally, you actually don't have, it just goes there.
Yeah, and this is also, and I will say, you know, because this was the thing when I was getting divorced, I thought it was really interesting. I had urges to laugh, and I did that actually. You know, trauma sometimes, instead of crying.
The giggles, we call it
you get the giggles and you laugh, and it's so weird, right? And now you're saying it comes from the same place.
I mean, you're talking, I was in the hospital, my mom had a stroke, and she was flat out, comatose, and she had just got up, and she went back. And instead of me freaking out, my brother and I burst out laughing, and we laughed for a half an hour, and then the crying happened. So the idea that you need something to break it. Don't be afraid of where your body takes you. Follow the cues. If laughter is what happens, laughter at least brings out, it allows that the shifting, the movement of the cells. Think about it, right? All we want to do is create movement in your body. So here you are, here's your Pandora's box of trauma, where I'll give it such a small box, such a big box, and it sits there stagnant. And like a snow globe, life will literally bring up one at a time. And if you do the healing work, it allows that each one to gently come up, so you can start looking at each one and going, okay, here you are. Let's resolve this.
Yeah.
And not by fixing it, resolving what created that disruption, and how can I now calibrate to that.
So can I ask you, so we live in a society that still really frowns upon being too emotional. So we know a gender stereotype with women is that women are too emotional often, you know, it's used almost, you know, against them. Men again are not expected to be emotional. You know, crying is traditionally and historically unacceptable for men because they need to be very masculine. How can we show up for other people? And I'm not saying we need to go out there and be therapists for other people, because that's impossible. We can't, but it really makes me think about, how do we manage other people being triggered by us? How within our families, if we see, you know, I want to say sort of, I don't want to use the term problematic, that's a term I thought about, but maybe self-destructive or destructive type of behaviors, if we can see something that is not healthy, unhealthy behaviors. Usually we move towards, something's wrong with that person, we want to punish them, we want to, the memes are always saying, remove yourself from toxicity. You can't always do that. You can't do that if it's your family, you can't do that if it's your child. You know, how can we, where does it leave us with this knowledge now that it's probably from trauma, that it is a trauma response?
And let's give it, right? What's the worst we can do if we say, yes, we are all traumatized? What's the worst that can happen? You start resolving it, instead of going, no, not me, not you, you know, you're pointing fingers everywhere else. So coming back to your question of, it almost sounds cheesy to say this, but kindness is such an underrated emotion. If you can meet somebody where they are at, where are you at, and you understand that, so you go and you've given everybody trauma, right? Everybody you meet now is traumatized. So you go and you ask yourself, I don't know your story, but I know that you are somewhat traumatized. So how can I be accepting of you? How can I be kind towards you? You will be much more gentle to the toxicity in the workplace, because you understand, if there's a boss that is throwing out his toys and you don't take responsibility for it, you go, you are traumatized. Something about you is making you act like this. It's not me. That is your trauma. How can I be kind to you? And kindness doesn't mean you need to go and pack the toys back in. It just means I am not going to be as aggressive with you. I'm not going to be reactive with you. I'm not going to react to anything you're going to say, because I understand that you are in a trauma position. So if you can walk with kindness and acceptance that each person you're going through is having a hard time, if you can just walk with that notion, and go, what's yours? You show me yours, I show you mine, kind of thing, right? That is exactly how trauma needs to work. Each person you walk with, and I would push it this far, share your trauma. Go and tell everybody what's happened, because it gives permission to everybody to say, something has happened to me and this is why I'm why I'm like this. And if you share, people hold compassion for you. You'll go, you know what, you had a rough day today, Lenina. You know, so I can see you a little aggro. I'm going to just step this way. Do you need a coffee? Do you need something? Do you see the level of support comes when you're vulnerable enough to share that? So I would say, this is the beginning of the revolution, is kindness and acceptance, and meet people where they're at, not where you want them to be at. That is the most important step. Meet your children where they are at, meet your colleagues where they're at, meet your boss where they're at, meet yourself where you're at, and not where you want it to be. And I think if you would just lay it there, I think we'd start a beautiful revolution.
You know, I love that you said that also, and after the break, because we do have to take a break, I wanted to just delve into a little bit about sort of that theory of expectations, you know, the expectation of how somebody else is supposed to act towards you or to repay for your kindness or whatever, and what that means for society. But before we chat about that, we are going to take a short break, and we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and we have been in conversation with therapist Yasmin Gabie. I'm sorry, you know, I am just like from the beginning of the show just struggling with it. But Yasmin, we've got you here, and we've been speaking about trauma, and we've said a lot. And so you left off before the break, and you were speaking about kindness. I was asking about you, so how, if we can acknowledge that everybody has got some kind of trauma, that other people's triggers aren't about us, because I find other people's trauma and responses to us is a large part of our trauma, right? And how we perceive the world. Yeah. And so you came in with the notion of sort of radical kindness, of meeting people where they are at instead of where we want them to be. And I hear exactly what you're saying, but it's such a difficult concept. Yeah. And so, and there is this line, I think, again, I'm bringing it in again, because also it's what I see in conversation. You know, there's a line about be kind and be the change you want to be and treat other people the way you want to be treated. But there is also this other side of a lot of people are toxic, whether it's, you know, treating you toxically rather than saying somebody is toxic, rather the relationship toxic and walking away. But I like the idea of radical kindness. I wanted to bring in, when you spoke about, you know, meet people where they are and not where you expect them to be. I find often that our expectations is a big problem. And I sort of just wanted to ask you open-ended sort of about that. Like, how can we manage our expectations? If I'm going to go and be kind, do I expect that someone else is going to be kind back? They may not necessarily be. You know, how do we tackle these expectations we have about human beings and human behavior?
And there's also the idea of being the bigger person. We're always told to be the bigger person, right?
Yeah.
And are we not tired of being the bigger person?
Hey.
Right? How tired are we of just always being the bigger person?
Yeah.
So that notion will always find its way in, because when somebody's throwing their toys out of their cot and you are entering that space, now you need to be the bigger person, to be kind. That doesn't work in that setting.
Yeah.
But what does work is, this is not my baby, this is not my circus. What he's doing has got nothing to do with me. Even if one of the things are directly aimed at me, even if a shoe is coming spinning at me, for you to be able to just have an awareness, a consciousness of whatever's going on there has got nothing to do with me. Often, the first thing we do is we get entrenched in that person's drama. That is the first thing that happens, this happening, and we take the responsibility of what is my role in this? What have I done to create this? And what can I do to make it better? And we take it on. And let's separate it for now, that this person is going through something, the boss is throwing his toys, he's freaking out. If you can just maintain your space, your own lane in this, that whatever he's doing has got nothing to do with me. Keep your own lane, get calibrated within your nervous system, and then do not ever merge with somebody that is in a tantrum, ever. It is not the time to speak. It is like a child having a meltdown. When you have a meltdown, you cannot communicate with that child. He's in the deepest processes of whatever's happening. All you need to do is create safety for the child. So if you can look at every person as that little child, you are actually, where are you right now in your meltdown? Are you at the beginning stages or you are in flee? What do you do when you have to keep yourself safe? Get calibrated, get yourself out of there, keep yourself, and then only engage when that person can meet you on a level that can speak to responsible, and adult to adult. So I know this seems very, very simple, right? Because when you're in it, we are in it. Because when the boss is throwing out his toys and it's gone into his child, we go into our child. And the child meets the child.
Yeah.
And then here we have that. But that needs to happen enough times in order for you to be able to retract and then learn the calibration. Once you learn calibration, you can then speak to the adult within yourself and then try and hold space for that child and allow the adult to emerge.
Oh, I love this. I want to ask you, we only have a few minutes left, so I just want to ask you one thing, which is a bit more practical, I think. You were saying that healing is a hard journey, and it's not a short journey also. And one of the things is, even though we've spoken about a lot here, maybe we've given some context to some of the stuff that we are experiencing and feeling, and people are going to be more aware and trying to figure out where in our bodies we feel things when we are triggered. Knowing about it doesn't necessarily immediately take that feeling away. So if I know I'm triggered, still I will, experience this again, and I'll feel my heart racing and the overwhelm and not be able to. Are there like a few practical things? I know breathing is one, I'll say that, because we all know what, count to 10, breathe, whatever, but are there practical things in the moment that we can do to sort of just recalibrate, maybe not fully, but just so that we don't tip over and fall apart and become overwhelmed?
And breath is always the one thing, right? But it's difficult to take a breath when you're in it.
Yeah.
Because the breath is shallow and it becomes more traumatizing.
And you're in survival mode,
Often,
right?
it's removing yourself from that process for at least a timeline. Whether you get to the bathroom, whether you get to fresh air, just to remove yourself from that context, to sort of cut away from it. Just to allow yourself to be removed from that energy of it. I think that would be the first step. But before you can get there, remember, today you are listening to the show. Here's the seed that's being planted. It might not take impact for still a while longer, but the seed is there. So forgiving yourself when you do get engaged with that drama, when you do throw your toys out of the cart, when you do remember, we are also the perpetrators. We are not only the victims. You have to figure out where you are the perpetrator and to forgive. Just to allow yourself to go, if I know better, I'll do better. Today, I just didn't know better. Now I know I'm going to do one thing different to the way I did it yesterday. If we can do incremental things, and I'm talking about, I call it the tick. It's not the 180, it's the tick. You just have to shift one thing within yourself, and that will incrementally build up and compound into the healing version that you want to see in yourself. But forgiveness is the key. Forgiveness to yourself. Don't worry about anyone else. When you mess up, to go, it's okay, breathe, you will do better tomorrow.
Yeah.
It will be okay. Go and rest, and when you know better, you will do better. If you can start there, you are well on your way, because your seed will sprout. It will take impact. And then we'll have fun.
I love that. I love that so much. We've come to the end of the show. Yasmin, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank you for those practical tips and also for us being able to unpack trauma. And I loved also that you said, this is the seed, but all the time. And I think, I sit and I speak to mental health stakeholders a lot, or professionals a lot. And that is the one thing also, that there's no magic pill, or there's no sort of magic thing you can do. It's going to take time. So I want to thank you very much for joining us here on Mental Health Matters. We will see you next week. I'm Lenina Rassool. Goodbye.